questions from that pre-filed testimony on the stand here today, would your answers be the same?
Rebuttal testimony provided by Navigator's consultants addressed concerns that I had in sections 6.2 and 6.4 of the application. Therefore, if I answer questions today, I would not bring up those concerns.
And what were those concerns?
My concern in section 6.2 was that they did not sufficiently address the superficial geology, but rather concentrated on the bedrock geology. My concern in section 6.4 was that they addressed groundwater hydrology, that is the aquifers that were being crossed, but did not mention the surface water streams and rivers that were being crossed.
Do you adopt this testimony as that pre-filed testimony as your sworn testimony in this proceeding?
Yes, it is.
I would offer Exhibit S5, which has been stipulated to.
Admitted.
I have no further questions and would tender this witness for trial.
Navigator.
Thank you, Mr. DeHuick. Good afternoon, Mr. Callen. My name is James Moore. I'm here on behalf of Navigator. Just to clarify for the record, the concern that you expressed with respect to section 6.2 in the application and your review of that section is that the maps that were included at that time were actually bedrock geology. They were too far below the surface when you were interested in surface geology, correct?
That's correct. They actually used maps that were published by my organization and the U.S. Geological Survey. And so I'm very familiar with the maps that they have used and know that those are bedrock geology maps that we produced in order to show what the geology would look like if you scraped off the 100 or 200 feet of overburden of glacial sediments above it.
And after your testimony, with your pre-filed testimony was submitted, Navigator provided additional maps through discovery to staff that showed the surface geology that you were interested in. Is that correct?
That's correct. They submitted maps that actually used a surface geology map that my organization also published.
And your conclusion stated in your pre-filed testimony was that there are no geological formations along the right-of-way that pose a risk to pipeline stability, in your opinion, and that's true regardless of which maps you looked at, correct?
It is true when you consider the surface geology.
All right. And so that's still your opinion after reviewing the surface geology maps that were provided?
That's correct.
And with respect to section 6.4 of the application, you were satisfied by the rebuttal testimony provided by Monica Howard that the surface water resources were sufficiently addressed in the application such that you did not have concern about adverse effects of the proposed pipeline project on surface waters.
That's correct.
So am I correct to understand that based on the review that you conducted, you do not have any concerns about the proposed project having adverse effects on the state resources that you considered and are not worried about unstable geological formations that might pose a threat to pipeline stability?
I'm not aware of any unstable geological formations that the pipeline crosses in eastern South Dakota. I did say in my testimony, though, as far as groundwater hydrology resources go, as the application states, they do cross the Big Sioux Aquifer, but I did state that as long as the pipeline is constructed and operated properly, the threat should be minimal.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
No questions from Mr. Hewitt. Thank you.
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Jordy.
Thank you. Sir, do you know where the route is going to be if this was approved, Navigator's hazardous route?
I have seen the route map, yes.
Okay, and so if they keep the route precisely where they indicate on whatever route map you've seen with your opinions with state?
Yes, they would.
All right. Where does your review from a geological perspective commence? Is it a millimeter below the topsoil, or what is really your kind of area of concern?
Right. So our area of concern really begins below the topsoil. So the topsoil being what generally you think the soil scientists dealing with, it's usually on the order of 3 feet thick. And once you get below that, you start to get into what we would call, what soil scientists would call the parent rock, which is literally the geology that's there. The soils are often derived from that geology, but that's where we really start, is when you get below that soil layer, that's approximately 3 feet. Now you're getting into the actual geologic formations and sediments that were laid down in that area a long time ago.
Is that 3 feet kind of a rule of thumb, or would you say that's consistent across the 5 counties at issue here?
It certainly is in general, that's the rule of thumb, but sometimes it might be 2 feet, sometimes it might be 4 or 5 feet thick for a soil layer. So it can vary, but generally it's what we just consider it to be the upper few feet is the topsoil.
And you're expressing any opinions about the stability of the topsoil itself on a per farm or per tract basis, are you?
I'm not a soil scientist. My expertise lies in the geology, not in the soils that exist on top of that geology.
Okay, so no opinions as to that 3 foot of the topsoil?
No.
And the rebuttal, I think someone mentioned Monica Howard, and what was it about her rebuttal that alleviated a concern you had?
Well, she alleviated 2 concerns that I had. The first being that when they initially addressed the geology in the application, they were addressing it from a standpoint of bedrock geology, meaning that geology is buried underneath the glacial sediments in eastern South Dakota. The glacial sediment overburden in the Arabia pipeline is generally over 100 feet thick. It can approach 200 feet thick in some areas. Now there are areas where it gets to be less than that, maybe 50 feet thick, and where it crosses the Sioux Quartzsite, it's hardly there at all. But those are the exception rather than the rule. So the concern I had was that what they're showing me in their application was the bedrock geology that was being crossed at great depth, not the immediate geology that pipe is buried in. What they did was they provided then supplemental maps that did show the shallow superficial geology, and that satisfied my concern. The second concern I had was that this section of the application, we think of that as groundwater hydrology, surface water hydrology, and in the hydrology section, I was expecting to see a mention of rivers or other significant streams with the pipeline. As it turns out, they have discussed a little bit about the aquatic habitat section, and actually provided a supplemental table in an appendix where they did list the rivers and other major streams that the pipeline was going to cross. So once that was clarified to me in their rebuttal testimony, that concern went away.
In terms of rivers, I think I probably understand what a river is, but other major streams, what's the definition of a major stream, and where is the cutoff line between a stream and something less?
So that is a concern, is the official name of that water body to determine whether it's a river. So if you look in, say, the official Federal Geographic Names Information System database, or on an official U.S. Geological Survey topographic map, you will see that the Big Sioux River is labeled the Big Sioux River. you will see that Split Rock Creek is labeled Split Rock Creek. Dairy Creek in Brookings County is labeled as such, not the Dairy River. Provide to determine if it was a creek or a river for the crossing.
Okay, so you literally rely on the existing name, not necessarily the criteria of age or distance from the bank.
We don't. And that definition can vary from part of the country to the other. You know, if you look at the size of Rapid Creek in Rapid City, that in eastern South Dakota, that's a river. A gray area and can change by geographic area as well. So that's why we basically rely on the GPS topographic maps to show us whether a river or a creek or stream when it was originally designated.
So the reliance then is on again, the federal data and their categorization convention of various water bodies. And does your analysis on the individual, say, within a specific farm site may not be named, but are tributaries or flow into other major waterways?
We do not. Our focus on groundwater resources.
And so ground creek that may either lead to or come from a tributary or more of a major waterway.
Could you clarify what you mean by my analysis?
Well, it's presented written testimony. That wasn't part of that.
No. I was just simply asked to evaluate the hydrology section, which discussed offers we crossed. I was also expecting to see what, and as it turns out that wasn't in there, and that's why I raised the concern.
Okay. But no specific like parcel by parcel analysis in terms of waterways or water features on a per parcel basis that could be impacted. That analysis is not in the allocation, correct?
Are you asking me if Navigator did that analysis?
Or did you see any such analysis?
So what I saw were maps showing what rivers and pipeline route they cross.
Okay. It was limited to the rivers and streams as defined by reference. All right. Thank you. I don't have anything further, sir.
With that, we have commission questions. Is memory correct? Commissioner Hansen was first last time. Commissioner Nelson? Gary? Your turn to start first.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Collins. Good to see you again. We gotta start meeting like this, don't we? Appreciate reading your testimony. Rebuttal on page 18. Have you read all 2 years? I know the changes on 6.2.
Yeah, and I don't have the rebuttal in front of me, but in her rebuttal, she addressed the concerns that I had in 6.2 and 6.4, so I no longer have those concerns.
Thank you. You said the big issue aquifer was a potential concern because of source of water for many persons. Do you have an idea how many persons?
How many? What I can tell you is that the Sioux Aquifer provides water to South Dakota, and that comprises a very large portion of the population of South Dakota. I do not have the number of people that are served.
I very much appreciate your testimony as always.
being here, and I have no questions.
Ditto. You're only the second person I haven't asked questions on, so congrats.
Mr. Rizzo, you didn't have any questions, did you? Is there any redirect?
I have no redirect.
I just have one question. Geologic formations area of the project way where if the route changed slightly but stayed on parcel where it's currently, that there might be consequences.
Foundation.
You may.
So I'm not aware of issues that would, a threat to the safety of the pipeline if they shifted the routes slightly.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony today.
No, I've got a question. What is the definition of slightly in the question Mr. Moore asked you? What did he mean by the word slightly?
I'm going to object as to the form of the question. He doesn't know what Mr. Moore meant, but if you want to ask him what he thinks he meant.
Precisely, that's my point, but we're slightly true. Thank you, nothing further.
For your testimony today.
Staff calls Alyssa Ingham. G-H-A-M. Stand over. Raise your right hand, please. Truth and nothing but the truth, so. Good afternoon. Could you please introduce? By whom are you employed? Resources management. What is your job? I am a learner. I serve in a technical and advisory. How did you become involved? File pre-filed testimony? I did. Into what we marked as Exhibit L in front of you. Do you recognize that document? I do. What is that document? This is the pre-filing. At the time of your pre-filed testimony, was the information therein to the best of your knowledge? Yes. Deletions or corrections to make at this time? I do. At the time that I filed this testimony, I reviewed the plan that was submitted on the same day. Agricultural protection was also filed with it. I review. I'm now seeing that Navigator has include mitigation measures for impacts on land used primarily for row crops. Negated that part of my
question or update. If I asked you the same questions in that testimony today, would your answer? Do you adopt this as your sworn testimony in this proceeding?
yes.
I move for the admission of Exhibit S12, which I believe is.
It is accepted.
Have you had a chance to review all the filings in this testimony?
Yes, I have. Yes, I am.
Would you agree that the maps in the application would you agree with the maps included in Exhibit A to identify noise-sensitive locations?
That assertion, it's very difficult at the scale 1 to 24,000. It's very difficult to tell what type of at and determining whether it would be a noise location.
Would you concur with the assertion that identifying rural along the route would not be merited?
The commission to properly review the mitigation suggested or that now forward as mitigation, determine sort of
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is James Moore. I'm here on behalf of Navigator. You evaluated Navigator's route selection process. Is that right?
I did.
And you agree that Navigator used appropriate methodology in evaluating and selecting a route?
I did, yes.
And you agree that Navigator took appropriate factors into consideration in that process?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the NEPA principles from the National Environmental Policy Act of avoidance, minimization, and mitigation?
I am.
And could you just explain those, please?
So when looking at a route or project or citing a project, the first step you would take is trying to find ways to avoid impacts on a resource. And then you would look at ways to minimize impacts. After that, if avoidance can't be avoided.
And then mitigation is
Yes.
the next step
Yes,
after minimization?
yeah. Correct, yes. So if minimization isn't enough, then to avoid impacts, then mitigation would be proposed.
And do you agree that that Navigator's routing process appears to have followed those principles?
I do.
And do you agree that, well, sorry, to ask a different question. Do you agree that a goal of route selection is to minimize impacts, as we just discussed?
I do.
And do you agree as a general principle that selecting a shorter route is going to minimize impacts and maximize efficiency?
I would say that the shortest route does not always minimize.
Can you give me an example of that?
I would say in my experience, working on pipeline projects, there are times when a slightly longer route may be appropriate. to avoid a significant impact on a resource,
Depends on what the impact is, where it's located.
of course.
And you agree that Navigator's route analysis is complete and compliant with industry standards?
I agree that the route analysis meets industry standards.
I want to make sure I understood what you said earlier. On page 4 of your pre-filed testimony, starting at line 116, in your answer at line 20, you talked about whether Navigator properly analyzed the compatibility of the proposed facility in regard to its effects on rural life and business farming. Did I understand?
Regard to its effects on rural life
And the business of farming. So did I understand your testimony that after reviewing additional information, including rebuttal testimony, that you did or did not continue to have concerns about that issue?
My concerns are alleviated after reviewing the additional materials provided.
And with respect to noise impacts, do you agree from your review that Navigator by compensation providing accommodations when necessary, persons who may be affected by noise impacts related to construction?
I agree that the mitigation measures are included in the application.
And do you agree that those are standard industry practice?
Yes, I do.
I think that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Taylor,
No questions for this witness, thank you.
Ms. Ellie Bailey,
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Jordy.
Does South Dakota deserve standard industry practices or something better?
Check the argument.
Overruled.
Sustained.
You're asking me if standard industry practices are appropriate for South Dakota?
No. No. So the term standard industry practices, undefined, just kind of thrown out there to make everyone feel good, basically. And I'm simply asking you, do you believe the people of South Dakota deserve whatever is standard in a very new industry from a company that's never done it before, or does South Dakota deserve something beyond that?
I'll object to the argumentative characterization of industry practices.
I'll continue with overrule.
Sustained.
I'm not quite sure how to answer the question. I've worked on several pipeline projects in South Dakota where similar standard industry have been used for running, and it seems appropriate for the state.
And those were not CO2 pipelines, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you were asking questions about route analysis by Mr. Moore and route select.
I've seen exhibits of the route, yes.
Okay, because a witness just before you testified that site-specific analysis couldn't be done until an initial route is known. And so I'm just curious, what route do you think that you were asked to analyze?
I looked at the route that was submitted with the application,
The initial route with the initial application
yes.
without modifications?
Is it the, I looked at all versions of the Exhibit A that have been submitted to date.
Okay. And so when you commented that in your testimony on page 3 that you reviewed section 2 of the Navigator application, which route, you're aware there's no route in section 2. There's no map, there's no route included, correct?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Do you know if and how far Navigator can deviate from whatever maps that you've reviewed that are purported to be the route?
Objection, that calls for a legal conclusion.
Okay, but I want her to answer the question too, but I don't think she needs a legal. Can you please ask that question again, Mr. Jordy? I do believe that you aren't really calling for a legal conclusion. You want something else.
Well, yes, thank you. I'll sure try. You were just engaged in some back and forth with Mr. Moore about route selection and was it appropriate? And my point, ma'am, is in order to make those opinions, you have to have analyzed a specific route, correct?
I did not analyze a specific route myself.
Okay. And you don't know as you sit here today if the actual route, whatever that may be, if that could contain 1,000, 2,000, 100, or 1 deviations from whatever you considered.
That's correct.
And you don't know as you sit here today if the actual route could be a mile or more away from whatever maps you looked at, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That's the nature of pipeline routing in general.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is why it's hard to have opinions on a specific route when we have no idea what the specific route actually is, correct?
It is, yes. I should clarify, I was reviewing the methodology that Navigator used to determine a route. I myself did not evaluate the route.
Okay, and I appreciate that clarification because that's what I thought you were getting at, but it was a little murky. So, Mr. Moore walked you through 3 factors: avoidance, or basically avoid, minimize, mitigate, essentially. Do you remember that factor?
I do, yes.
And so avoidance is 100% in control of the proposed pipeline company, correct?
Yes.
And you're aware from your experience that pipeline companies, for-profit businesses, they have somewhere where there's a terminus and they have somewhere that's starting, and they like to go as straight a line as possible as they can, correct?
Yes.
And so they tend to draw a line as straight as possible on the map, and then after they've done that on the desktop, then they analyze what are the potential problems on the route we would prefer, correct?
Correct.
And what doesn't happen is typically, let's look at all the potential issues, let's talk to the communities, let's look at the master plans, be the best partner we can, and then we'll do a route. That's typically not how the process works. Is that correct?
I would say most companies have a general route in mind before they go forward with reviewing master plans and talking to the community, yes.
And would you agree that when companies generate their initial route, that the shorter the distance tends to be the cheaper the route, and that tends to be what companies want to go with?
I generally would object to the fact that shorter is always cheaper. It can be quite costly, impacts on, I guess the cost of constructing the pipeline isn't always the most expensive or the biggest factor in determining the route.
Yep, and in your answer, you inserted the word always. It wasn't in my question, but so generally, the shorter the route, the cheaper the route, generally speaking.
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. And so the avoidance piece, again, that's 100% in control of the pipeline company because they are the one proposing whatever route it is that we're now looking at, correct?
Yes.
And then if they decide that they do not want to avoid a high consequence area as defined by the federal government, or an actual real life high consequence area defined by simply just looking at what exists, then you would move to how do we minimize any impacts, correct?
Correct.
So they're free to choose a route that directly impacts and potentially negatively affects certain areas, and then they simply move to, well, how do we try to minimize the negative effects that might occur?
Are you asking if an applicant is able to propose a route that does impact, have environmental consequences?
Well, certainly as long as it's lawful, they can choose to route through the most difficult terrain, they can route through wetlands, they can route through anything that's legally able to be routed through, correct?
Yes, an
Okay.
applicant's free to propose a route that has environmental impact.
Right. And then we move to minimizing, and so that's kind of like we acknowledge we're not avoiding something that could have been avoided because we've decided we are not going to reroute, and now we're in the, well, how do we minimize potential negative effects category, correct?
Yes.
And then if they, in their sole capacity, make that decision, what then takes us into the mitigation? Is that if we can't sufficiently minimize it, then we try to mitigate, or how do we get to the third layer?
Yes, if minimization, after minimization is done to the best, most extent possible, then we move on to mitigation.
Okay, and so, and the determination of if we have minimized this to our satisfaction, is that in the pipeline company's discretion?
I would say it's often the pipeline company, yes, does have some discretion, but it's often in conjunction with landowner negotiations, with discussions with agencies, other agencies that are involved in providing approvals. I would say in order to get your project approved by all of the regulatory agencies required, the applicant is often making those decisions in the interest of getting a permit approved.
And in the interest of getting a permit approved in your practice, is it typical that the pipeline company or the applicant would first go through those steps of interacting with the landowners, getting all the necessary surveys, and having the best?
Can you restate the question?
Before understanding the mitigation, what mitigation efforts might be needed?
I would say the effort to minimize impacts is often a long process and goes through multiple iterations. If you're suggesting that all full knowledge of every environmental consequence that needs to be before a route can be decided, I don't agree with that.
No, and did you, okay, we might be miscommunicating. Did you hear the word all in my question? Because I'm not suggesting that. Do you need me to re-ask the question?
Please.
Okay. So we were talking about avoidance, minimize, and now you're helping us understand how we get from the minimize into the mitigation. And to recap, if the pipeline company, for whatever reason, the potential negative impacts appropriately, then we go into the mitigation phase, correct?
Correct.
And in your answer, you said, well, typically that is in consultation with the landowners and other gathering of other information. Do you recall that answer?
I do.
Okay, and so I want to pick up right there. So you would agree then that in order to have the most robust or appropriate mitigation measures, that it's important to know specific features which would be learned by engagement with landowners?
Yes.
Okay, all right. And on a project like this that only has % easements and 70% the landowners have not engaged in that type of communication, and where all the surveys aren't done, would you agree that it's premature for us to successfully analyze any mitigation measures?
Object foundation and argument.
Sustained.
Okay, are you testifying as an expert witness here?
I am.
Okay, so here's a hypothetical for you. Hypothetical is this company, Heartland Navigator Greenway, or Navigator Heartland Greenway, needs easements on 100% of whatever the initial route is to locate a pipeline. Do you understand that?
I don't understand that.
Okay, all right. Assume that this proposed route is approximately 111.9 miles long, and assume that there's only 30% of those miles have been accounted for in terms of agreements with the necessary landowners, and assume that not nearly all the surveys have been done to learn the type of information you and I have just been talking about. Would you agree with me that it would be most appropriate, therefore, to wait until we have a better and more robust picture when analyzing potential mitigation measures?
Same objection.
She can answer a hypothetical question. What's the objection?
The objection was foundation and argument.
And I sustained, and I think
Okay.
we gotta get away from asking speculative, drawing.
Well, okay.
So-
Hypothetical questions and asked to assume and then give assumptions. So there is no foundation objection. So I just want to make that very clear for our public. Were you No, you weren't asked to do anything related to groundwater, were you? You were just.
I was not.
Okay, all right, very good. And your firm, are you typically hired by companies to help them with their environmental review services?
We support applicants as well as third-party work for agency reviews.
Okay, so applicants like here, and then the third-party work is what companies applicants hire to do work?
Yes, if an agency is required to write an environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment, my company is hired to do that research and writing.
All right, one of your answers related to a robust route analysis and optimization was answered that Navigator appears to have conducted a route analysis and optimization in line with industry standards and South Dakota administrative rules. What were the administrative rules that you used to make that, or to give that?
I don't know off the top of my head if it's not in my answer.
Okay, all right. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your testimony.
Commissioner Nelson.
Thanks for being here to help us out, and I have no questions.
Chair Vegan.
Thank you for being here, and you came all the way from California, it looks like. So welcome.
Thank you.
See, here you can be in the central time zone, or
It is very confusing.
exactly.
I spent a lot of time in the Dakotas, so I'm used to it.
Okay. A quick question on carbon pipelines. When you have worked, 10, you've been here like 11 years at this company that you're at?
12 years, yes.
12 years, okay. So out of 12 years, what percent pipelines compared to other?
I've never worked on a carbon pipeline.
So this is the very first time you're analyzing a route carbon pipeline?
I would say I did not analyze the route. I just reviewed the application. But yes, I'm not for a carbon pipeline.
So when you review the do you look at community impact, landowners consideration, safety?
My review was limited to those related to land use, and I'm trying to get the exact regulation here so I can say South Dakota Administration team. So just land use.
Okay, so for land use, do you also look at future development of that area? Would that be land use, and is that part of that rule?
Well, that rule does say that the application should look at current and future considerations for those categories.
So then when you looked at your review of this route, the first time that you looked at a carbon pipeline route, did you look at the future development potentials of the route?
I did not do my own analysis on that. So I myself didn't do any analysis about any future developments in the area.
So how did you analyze land use?
I was looking at how well the application met the requirements that were in the administrative rules.
So are you aware of the 4 items that the 3 commissioners have to look at according to state law?
Yes, you could remind me, but I did look.
Well, the 4th one is whether the project will unduly interfere with the orderly development of the region and due consideration, and then it goes on. But it is the future development of the region. So that wasn't part of your analysis?
That was not part of my analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for being here. I have no questions. Have a safe trip.
Thank you.
Redirect.
Mr. DeHuey, just a question on, of course, this is the PUC staff, so they get to do redirect, but the questions that go around then to the parties is only from the questions of commissioners, correct?
Correct.
We talked with Mr. Jordy about potential changes to a route. Would you agree that its route, that those changes should be brought to the commission so that we could analyze them? And
Yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
That concludes your testimony.
Thank you.
Is that didn't we go around on a quick ask of,
So I just got done asking questions, so then the parties, if they have a question.
okay, you
the
want
3
to
commissioners-
extend them to that round of
Well, I thought
Okay.
that's what we've always done in the last 5 or 6 days.
miscommunication? Okay.
I have nothing else. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Taylor,
Nothing, thank you.
Ms. Bailey.
No questions.
Just one.
Yep. Thank you. Okay. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
And the next witness I'm going to call, I'm sorry, is out of order from what I said last night. I had said after Ms. Ingham, we were going to call Brian Sterner. Flip-flop to calls Matt Frizzell.
Spell your last name. Raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
yourself for the record?
Yes, my name is Matt Frizzell. I'm with Environmental Resources Management based out of the Dallas, Texas office, and I'm a principal consultant there.
And how did you become involved in this docket?
ERM was hired by the state to provide expert witness testimony.
Did you provide pre-filed testimony?
Yes, ma'am.
Turning your attention to the document in front of you, marked as Exhibit S13, do you recognize that document?
Yes, I do.
And what is that document?
That is my pre-filed testimony.
And at the time you wrote your pre-filed testimony, was the information therein correct, true and correct to the best of your knowledge?
Yes, it was.
Do you have any additions, deletions, or corrections to make?
No.
If I asked you these same questions here today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Do you adopt this as your sworn testimony in this proceeding?
Yes.
I would move for the admission of Exhibit S13.
It is admitted.
Within your pre-filed testimony, you raised some concerns about insufficient modeling information. Since the time of your pre-filed testimony, have you received any additional information from Navigator?
We did. We received some further information on their dispersion. Some, but not all.
What standing concerns do you have? If you could just summarize those for us.
Sure. First is going to be the pressure at which the dispersion modeling was executed, and then second, the relationship of the potential dispersion distances in relation to high consequence areas or unusually sensitive areas.
And what do you mean by the pressure at which?
Right. In the information provided, they provided a range at which the pipeline would operate, but not necessarily the specific temperature at which the modeling runs were conducted.
I can't quite hear you. Temperature at which the modeling runs.
Sorry, the pressure at which the modeling runs were evaluated out.
And why would that be important?
It's a significant factor in determining the distance at which the dispersion modeling will travel, or the plume will travel. So it's a pretty big lever, so to speak, in the dispersion modeling world.
What was the other, you listed one other concern that was outstanding. What was that?
Yes, the relation between the plume distances and that distance in relation to the high consequence areas.
And why would that be important?
It's very useful in determining, whether or not, if a leak did occur, whether or not a plume could impact a high consequence or unusually sensitive area.
Do you have any additional recommendations that were not included in your testimony?
Not this.
Your attention to Exhibit S8 in that box there. If you could take that out for me, please. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you recognize that document?
I do.
What is that document?
It's Adam D'Antonio's direct testimony that I'm adopting.
Do you work with Mr. D'Antonio?
Yes, I do.
Are you familiar with the contents of that testimony?
I am.
Are you able to testify to the contents of that testimony?
Yes.
Are you competent to testify on the subject matter?
I am, yes.
If I asked you all of the same questions in Exhibit S8, would your answers be the same?
It would be.
Do you adopt that as your own testimony today?
I do, yes.
I move for the admission of Exhibit S8.
It is admitted.
I have no further questions and would tender this witness for cross.
Cross-examination by the applicant.
Thank you, Mr. DeHuick. Good afternoon, Mr. Frizzell. My name is James Moore. I'm here on behalf of Navigator. With respect to the adoption of Mr. D'Antonio's testimony, there were concerns in there about recommendations that he made with respect to provisions that could be included in Navigator's environmental construction. And did you see that Navigator has agreed to make those changes to its ECG and it did so?
I did not see that, but I'm aware now.
Okay, thank you. With respect to dispersion analysis, plume modeling, since your testimony, my understanding is that you have reviewed what's been marked as Exhibit N47A, which is Navigator's air dispersion guidance document, including results from the plume modeling that was conducted. Is that correct?
With the original version of that document I received only had the tables at the very end and not the first part. I received that document when I arrived late yesterday.
So have you had a chance to review it?
Briefly, yes.
Did you hear the testimony of Steve Lee during this hearing about the modeling that was done?
No, I was not here for that.
All right, and you've not reviewed the transcript of that?
I reviewed some of the transcript, but not all.
Okay. Did you learn anything from the transcript of Mr. Lee's testimony that you reviewed related to any concerns you have about the modeling that was done?
Nothing that would change my opinion.
With respect to the modeling that was done, do you have any concerns about Navigator having chosen to do dispersion modeling using both the Aloha and the FAST models for purposes of assistance in determining the route of the pipeline?
No concerns. Those are industry best practices, the use of those two programs, and widely accepted within the industry to do consequence analysis and dispersion modeling.
And are you aware that Navigator worked with DNV in doing the FAST modeling that was done?
Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with DNV?
I am.
And is DNV a reputable company with expertise in conducting the FAST dispersion modeling?
They are, yes.
And do you think it was appropriate for Navigator to contract with and work with DNV in connection with the FAST model?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the real world experiment that DNV did in 2015 at the Statum to validate its FAST modeling?
I am aware. It's been a while since I've read it, but yes, I'm aware. It's one of the few that have been validated against real world examples. So.
And was that experiment published? Were the results of that experiment published after it was done?
Yes.
Contemporaneously?
Yes, it was.
Was that well known in your area of expertise?
Yes, that study is well known.
With respect to your first stated concern, I just want to make sure I understand this. You said that you're uncertain about the pressure at which the modeling runs were evaluated or run, which I understand to mean that you did not see that information in the analysis, not that there were pressures indicated that you thought were inappropriate.
Correct. Yeah. In the analysis, it states that the pipeline will operate between, I believe, 2,100 pounds and 1,300 psi. But what I did not see was the corresponding release pressure of the modeling run.
So again, Mr. Frizzell, looking at the document marked as N47A, which is a confidential document, and I guess I'm not asking you to look at it right now, but you said you reviewed it when you got to peer, correct?
Briefly.
And it indicates that inputs to the FAST model that were done included release pressure. And I want to make sure that that's what you're talking about.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, and you didn't see a value assigned to that in the results. Is that your concern?
Correct, for each modeling run that was identified.
All right, thank you. With respect to instances to HCAs or unusually sensitive areas, could you just again restate your concern for me so I make sure I understand it?
Yes, sir. So it would be useful to see potentially on a map or a figure whether or not the dispersion has the potential to come in contact with any HCAs. So is it, does it get close to an HCA, but is it within 5 feet? Is it overlaying the HCA? It's not evident to me at this point of what that would look like.
And
Wait a minute, I didn't get it. It's not evident to me at this point.
What those figures would look like and what the impacts are. Yes.
So it is, I want to make sure again I'm understanding your testimony, but is that a different process than doing a site-specific dispersion analysis for the purpose of determining could affect HCAs as required by the integrity management program?
Yeah, it is always, not always, but generally included in dispersion modeling. Doing dispersion modeling just for the sake of dispersion modeling without understanding the effects of it is to determine what the effects are if a release occurs.
So your concern is that the effects on HCAs were not considered as part of the initial dispersion analysis that was done.
Yes, sir.
You previously reviewed the plume modeling overview that Navigator submitted early on in this process, correct? And does that document indicate that that in fact was considered? That plume modeling was used in identifying the potential impact radius with direct and indirect effects on high consequence areas?
I believe it speaks to the potential for that to occur, not that it would occur or what those effects would be on the HCAs.
Have you reviewed Exhibit N42? It's a confidential document, so I'm not sure where it shows up on the computer in front of you.
Approach?
Yes, please do.
If I have to caution about returning computer because I don't want to see film.
Yes, I was made aware of this late yesterday. I didn't review it in my original testimony.
So does that document, which says it shows the design and mainline valve locations with HCA Navigator is considered the effects of dispersion on HCAs as part of its analysis.
Foundation.
Overruled.
This figure appears to only show, I believe, the center line path of the pipeline and not the dispersion distances from the center line and how far that either does or does not impact an HCA.
While we're waiting, Sherry, how long do you think you can go yet? And this is off, you don't have to type this, because I know they're looking stuff over there. And I wanna make sure the public doesn't think they're lying and dead. Maybe there's music going on, right? You're pretty good, great, alright. Just for the public, we're just waiting for our questions. You're still online.
So again, Mr. Frizzell, so I understand, I'm looking at Exhibit NC2, which on page 4 indicates that the plume modeling and air dispersion aid in identifying the potential impact radius and direct and indirect HCA impacts. And then with respect to initial routing, it states that the evaluation for direct HCA impact was considered with respect to what's listed there. That you're telling me that that's not responsive to your concern, and I just want to understand why.
Form.
Overruled.
Yes, sir. So this document, my original review application, and it does a really good job of saying, you know, what was done, what we plan to do, but it doesn't give me, you know, the detail of the inputs or the visual outputs as to, you know, which HCAs are impacted or, you know, to what extent they're impacted.
Mr. Frizzell, looking at page 4 of your direct testimony with respect to the question asked on line 121, in your answer, starting on line 126, you say that the PHMSA Part 192 specific buffer distances seem reasonable based on the information provided in the table. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Again, so your specific concern that you're talking about here is that despite the buffer distances seeming reasonable, there's no showing of direct or indirect effects on HCAs with respect to the dispersion analysis that was done. Is that correct?
The PHMSA buffer distance is one of many items we would look at with respect to dispersion modeling. It's not the only one.
Thank you. That's all I have for you at the moment.
Mr. Taylor?
No questions, thank you.
Ms. Bailey?
No questions.
Mr. Doherty?
Yes, thank you. Sir, you were asked some questions about the Aloha and FAST models, and I believe you stated that Aloha and FAST are models that are commonly used by industry, by pipeline companies.
Yes.
And would you agree, sir, that the Aloha model has a low ability to deal with complexity of inputs or complex inputs?
Yes.
And would you also agree that it has no ability whatsoever, Aloha, to deal with or account for complex terrain or obstructions that may be present in a specific area?
That's correct, yes.
And Aloha also has a low ability to deal with and account for complex meteorology.
Agreed, yes.
And then if we go to FAST, you'd agree with that FAST is a little better on complexity of inputs, but
Yes, it's not the highest degree, but it's pretty good at what it does.
and FAST has no ability whatsoever to account for
That's correct. It assumes flat land.
correct. And FAST also has a very low ability to account for complex meteorology.
It has some meteorological functions, but it's not the most complex.
And are you familiar with this?
I am, yes.
And would you agree with me, as other witnesses have testified here, that that type of analysis does have a high ability to deal with complex inputs?
I would agree with that. It has the ability to model complexities, but would not be the best option for this modeling choice.
And you base that on what being the goal for modeling?
To determine dispersion distances and effects on HCAs.
So, and that would be if we only cared about flatland analysis.
Not necessarily.
So if we had an option that allowed us to deal with complex terrains, deal with complex meteorology, and give us a kind of a robust view, you would say that a program that cannot do those things is better?
No, the use of computational fluid dynamics from a dispersion modeling setting, a lot of people think it's going to be more accurate. It's going to give you the best answer, where you can generally arrive at the same answer using FAST as you would computational fluid dynamics. CFD modeling or computational fluid dynamics is a great tool if you're modeling a pump motor or an airplane wing or something small and finite. It wasn't originally designed for large projects such as a pipeline. It can do it. it requires a lot of inputs and it takes up a lot of time.
Okay, and so if we wanted to know the effects of a community where there are barns and silos and complex terrain, to know about South Dakota winds can blow, would you agree that a computational fluid dynamics, considering if we picked a specific area, would be helpful in giving us some data related to the plume and its effects on PCAs?
It can definitely do it. It can provide that information that you just listed. FAST would be able to do the same thing as well.
Have you run any of these tests on anywhere in South Dakota specific to back up your opinion that they could be similar results?
I have not done any modeling for this.
Are you aware that Navigator is right now in the midst of contracting between 1, 2, or 3 firms to run computational fluid dynamic analysis so that information can be known in that regard for South Dakota?
When I arrived yesterday, I was made aware of that.
Okay. And you wouldn't say that's an unreasonable waste of time or that they're doing something foolish, would you?
Not necessarily foolish. The industry has really arrived at FAST being a good approach and industry best practice. If they want to take a step above and do CFD modeling, then that's great.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. Now, you had stated that you initially were provided Navigator N47, which didn't have the narrative and kind of the explanation. It was just tables of data, correct?
Yes.
Now, do you have any idea why the complete version just became an exhibit in this hearing late Wednesday evening of last week?
No, I don't know why.
Okay. And have you had a sufficient amount of time to thoroughly review Exhibit 47A to be asked any type of questions and opinions about that document in its entirety?
I spent probably 3 hours last night, but would obviously want some more time just to make sure I'm totally squared away on it.
Understood, that's fair. Did you ever compare the data from the appendices in 47A with the buffer zone and calculations that were found in Navigator Exhibit 62?
No, I haven't compared those.
Okay. Would you be surprised to learn that the numbers and the distances and feet are different between both exhibits?
I wouldn't necessarily be surprised, because a lot can change between modeling runs. So there's a lot of different factors and inputs that can change those distances. So the fact that they're different is interesting, but it's not alarming at this point.
At this point, and that's because, to be fair to you, you haven't had a chance to fully vet the balance of the document, correct?
Correct.
You had talked about that you identified the CO2 release rate as something that was initially, I think, missing from the Navigator data. Is that correct?
The pressure.
Okay. Is the pressure, when you pressure, is that the operating pipe pressure that you're talking about, or release rate pressure?
No, it's a great question. There's a few bits and pieces to that. So there's the pipeline operating pressure, and then there's the release pressure. The pipeline can operate anywhere, from my understanding, between 1,300 PSIG to 2,200 or 2,100 PSIG. Ideally, the release pressure would be somewhere in that range, but it could be lower than that. It could be higher than that. I don't know because I haven't seen that in record. It could be at the burst pressure of the pipe. It could be at the burst pressure of the wells. I don't know. So that was a useful piece of information, and it governs the dispersion distances.
Well, correct, exactly. And so we only have in this record in terms of data and computations, what Navigator has presented as the evidence it wants us to see. And you would agree with me that whenever it's selecting the inputs to plug into, whether it be FAST, Aloha, or computational fluid dynamics, the inputs control what the outputs are, correct?
Yes.
And the persons or persons selecting the inputs obviously can tweak the inputs per category and come up with a variety of different results using the same, for instance, 8-inch diameter pipeline.
Correct, yeah.
And when you and those were the same appendices that were on 47 that you had previously, did you see that there's only certain types of situations that are modeled there? In fact, we only have 9 different variables that are included in the
Yes, I did see that.
And for instance, wind speed, there are exactly 3 analyses done with 3.3 mile an hour wind speed, 3 with 11.2 wind speed, and then 3 with 17.9 wind speed. Do you have any idea how those wind speeds were chosen?
I don't. I believe some of the sources would be information from NOAA or something like that.
That would be
From NOAA.
okay. And to be fair, sir, that would be your guess, or do you know for a fact that's what occurred, or?
I don't know for a fact.
Okay, all right, understood. And so you were talking about the fact that we might have some numbers here that are, of course, generated from either a study Navigator conducted or paid their contractors to conduct for them, but we don't have a depiction or an overlay at scale to show basically and allow us to understand what's the significance of these numbers. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Sir, I'm going to ask you, there's a computer in front of you there, and there are a couple folders. One of them should say landowners exhibits or LO in the upper left there. And if I could just have you click on LO 123, please. And once you have that up, just let me know, please.
You said 123?
Yes, 123. I could give you a hard copy if that's preferred.
Yeah, I'm sorry, this mouse is like automatically moving. That's weird.
All right, so in any event, you've got a hard copy of 123 in front of you there, sir, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, and so I'm not asking any questions specific about this document, sir, other than just to get a sense of what you were stating. You see how there's a map here of some of the potentially affected counties, and then we've got an overlay of some spheres that show, based on the data used here, of how far in miles a potential plume could travel.
Yes, I see the map with the circles placed or overlaid.
Okay. And I'm not asking you to comment on the veracity or lack thereof of this map, but I'm simply trying to get a sense from you. When you were describing earlier that you didn't see a map, is it something like that, and it's just simply a map with the HCAs or sensitive areas or whatever we identify as avoidance or areas, and with the plume model based on the data on a map?
Yes, that's correct. Something similar to this.
And if you could just turn forward to page LO 126, please. And again, something similar to that, where it's shown in relation to towns and other.
Something similar, yes. I believe the 4.5 mile radius seems a little bit excessive, but yes, something similar to this map.
Okay. And then again, if we go to exhibit LO 127, again, something similar, at least in the pictorial concept of what that shows.
Correct, yes.
All right. Now, would you agree that plumes, they travel, it's unlikely that they will travel in a perfect sphere, like a mushroom, right?
Agreed.
Okay. And variable, the weather variables, temperature, those type of things, they can greatly affect, as well as terrain. Correct?
Absolutely.
And are those some of the reasons why you believe in order to understand the impact of these numbers or the significance, we really need to see them overlaid on areas of concern and kind of site-specific regions?
Yes. Otherwise, they're just numbers on a page. They don't really, you can't really put two and two together.
Got it. Now, sir, you talked, or no, you were asked a question. Mr. Moore embedded it in the question, a real-world study conducted by DNV. Do you remember that line of questioning?
Yeah.
Reality show fans, which, sir, you understand or agree with me that reality TV is far from reality. It's scripted. It's not reality at all. Is that fair?
Correct, yeah.
All right. And so when we conduct a test and control all the variables and go forth on endeavoring to recreate reality, that in of itself is not a real world test. Would you agree?
Potentially. I think DMV has a pretty good track record of producing quality studies and software packages that are used and validated through multiple means, but potentially that could occur.
Will, do you know the amount of metric tons of CO2 that would be in a pipeline at full capacity of the type that DNV and their England test utilized in a real world example?
I don't have that number on the top of my head.
And it would depend, to be a real world example, we would have to know, we compare the total amount of volume from one control to whatever the real world example is to know if we're comparing apples to apples.
can you restate that one more time to make sure I can understand?
Yes, because I'm just going to dig in a little bit to this DNV, the test in England, so we can clarify some things. Do you of CO2 in that test is not anywhere close to the volume of CO2 that would be found in the Navigator pipeline here based on the size and the length of the pipe if this project were approved?
I understand that they, probably did it at a different scale than what would be seen in a pipeline, but not going to change very much from volume to volume, only the dispersion distances.
Right, the dispersion distances. I mean, ultimately here you understand we're worried about the dispersion distance, correct?
Correct.
Are you aware of a 2015 scientific paper entitled Kosher, C-O-S-H-E-R, Joint Industry Project, Large-Scale Pipeline Rupture Test to Study CO2 Release and Dispersion?
No, I'm not familiar.
That what actually was released from the real world, in quotes, test was approximately 136 tons of CO2 over 204 seconds.
Familiar with that paper?
Sustained.
Okay.
He doesn't have any basis to, yes, let's move on.
That's fine. So you would agree that the real world test about that you, as you sit here today, don't know the amounts in tons of CO2 that were actually released in that quote-unquote real world test, and don't know how that pertains to or equates to the actual real world of if this pipeline was constructed based on the construction standards and distances and diameters that.
I think comparing what was done in the experiment to what would happen here, though we can model it very well, there's still going to be some differences.
Okay, all right, and that's, you probably saved yourself a lot more questions by just giving that answer, so I appreciate that. Mr. Moore asked you on page 4 of your testimony, we were down in lines about 126 through 128, where you were making some statements related to PHMSA Part 192 buffer distance. Do you remember that?
Yes.
All right. And the sentence you have in your answer there reads, the PHMSA Part 192 specific buffer distances seem reasonable based on the information provided in the table, correct?
Yes, correct.
And I didn't understand what you meant by that. You believe what PHMSA has determined as buffer distances in the PHMSA table is reasonable, or reasonable distances.
The buffer distances developed using the PHMSA methodology seem reasonable because it's based off the operating characteristics of the pipeline.
Okay. And then turning back to the buffer distances as found in N62, that kind of 5-page executive summary, to your point, because we just have numbers in a table without overlaying as we just went through in the actual areas in question here, they don't really tell us much.
Distance at which the dispersion will travel, but in relation to the HCAs.
And not just in relation to the HCAs, but in relation to anything that is located within those distances that one might be concerned about.
Correct.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Any final redirect from staff? Let's take a break. that's a 15-minute, Sherry? Okay.
I'm glad I'm not the only one who's done that.
Okay. Well, I see strong reason for grace and justification all along the way. As I apologize for being assembling order, I want to try to get that on track, straighten out and switch soon, and I'm gonna work towards doing the same order. Yep, okay, okay. Now, starting with, you were just first on the oh, if I'm not mistaken. Now we're moving down. You've got plenty of time. That's all gone. I chew it. You probably noticed that's what you're chewing gum. So, if you would like a piece of gum, I have multiple flavors and textures
I do have a lot of gum
and
too.
things to put in my mouth.
I do try, I do chew it a lot.
And during the baseball season, I try not to chew the seeds. Yeah. Dude, I thought you wanted to ask somebody a question. I thought you meant the very first witness. No. I was so confused, Greg, that I started.
In general, and you, after you're done, you can just walk down and I'll give you some. But have no idea, but, you know, they've got so many listed. I don't, yeah. Well, they don't have that many. Well, I didn't get your official list.
Maybe we should have like PT now.
What?
Tell me what we should all do in PT.
Right. Today's over. Well, you're gonna do mid-session. If you don't mind me lying on the floor doing it.
Well, we did it in your office during, we had PT meetings in this office. That was all day, wasn't it?
You
It was
guys
like 8:30 till 5.
stressed it out.
Oh, we stretched the whole 6 hours.
You did. I sat and watched. I've been doing things here. Fly. But I need to go and do it again tonight.
I kept like when I was trying to answer, I was bring me back. I got it. I'll find it. It's fast.
Don't bat your eyes at me.
Does your computer work now?
Yes.
We're close, but yeah.
After that, we're done. You want to go around? Get a restaurant. At some point, I think right after.
When someone has a slower pace, I'm sure you can just like, this is my favorite witness. A lot of people that are like, I can feel the heat coming out of the shower. The heat just coming off, the flames coming out of my machine.
That was a, you ready? Okay. I'll ask everyone to take their seats and we will begin. And we will begin with Chair Fegan's questioning of Mr. Frizzell.
Thank you, and thank you for coming up here from Texas. You make the weather a little cooler down there so we don't have to have stress on the grid up here. We appreciate that.
See what I can do.
Thank you. Experience, and I've been asking this question about, and actually, tell me about your experience.
Sure. So, early in my career, I worked in a position, meaning I worked for a consulting firm, and I worked 100% at an operating company of CO2 pipelines. So, I worked in their engineering team, helping them with mechanical integrity and some of their asset integrity programs, which involved dispersion modeling, things of that nature.
So you're one of the first witnesses that have experience in this and have been out in the field and have done it. Where were those pipelines at?
Some of them are in Colorado. Some of them are Gulf Coast of Texas and stretch all the way into Georgia and Mississippi.
So the commissioners, as you know, sit behind a closed door. And we don't get to talk to anybody until we are in a public meeting and the evidence are at hand.
Sure.
So this commissioner became very frustrated when she saw data requests. Could you go to N37? N37. It's a, no, it's not.
All right, I've got it.
Could you go to page 4 where it's 4-3?
Okay.
It looks like the staff asked for information dealing with dispersion modeling, correct?
Yes, sir.
And there was an objection from the company. Can you read that objection?
The response?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Objection. This request seeks information that is confidential for safety and security reasons, subject to the protected order entered by the commission. Attached is an overview that states the high consequence areas in South Dakota.
So they also had another data request. I think it was N38. Can you go to that one?
Yes, ma'am.
5-10. Don't know what page that's on.
Okay, I have it here.
Is it similar?
Yes, ma'am. It's similar in that it's an objection, and that they state a reason for the objection is that the information is confidential, proprietary.
When was do you remember when your pre-filed testimony was due as an expert witness for this commission? Was it the end of May?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you know when this application was filed? Was it filed back possibly in September of 2022?
I believe that's correct, yes.
And so you fly in from Texas, and you finally get the details of the plume study right before you get to be an expert witness for the Public Utilities Commission that is making a very big decision on carbon pipelines.
Yes, ma'am, we did receive some information at first, but the data request specifically speaks to, the inputs, what govern the inputs, and then how the results, could be interpreted. So, from what I've read so far on the updated information is, it's got a lot about the inputs, not necessarily the information we're looking for on the outputs.
So would it have been helpful during your data request responses preparing to be an expert? Be able to look at the inputs and the outputs, because as you know, modeling, junk in, junk out.
Absolutely, yeah, it would be useful.
So you had no input in the modeling, and you could have made some suggestions so you were comfortable.
We received some information, and we had a meeting to discuss what additional information would be useful. But yeah, it would have been good to have that information up front.
And it would have been good because you would have been more comfortable with your testimony today.
I'm comfortable with the testimony I provided, but it would have been a little bit more in depth.
That's better. That's better questioning. See, I'm not an attorney. So we've talked a lot about CFD modeling, and that it may be a good idea to do that maybe around HCA, maybe not everywhere, but at least around those areas. Would that be helpful to make sure we have a more complex study and understand the possibilities?
It's my opinion that facts can get you overwhelming majority of the way there with respect to HCA analysis. Is it going to be as detailed as CFD analysis? No. CFD is going to be great specifically for this region due to the topography. You've got a lot of changes in topography, and that's what it's going to be useful for. So in that aspect, yes, it's going to be useful.
Have you been out on the route at all?
No, I've not been out on the proposed route.
So there's lots of rolling hills, lots of little creeks. And as you know, the weather in South Dakota changes minute by minute. The wind changes, the direction of the wind changes. I mean, we have so much variation here.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the CFD model would be more valuable maybe in an area that has rolling hills and a lot of weather changes?
Potentially, yes. You can definitely get more detailed. It might not change the dispersion distance because there's some assumptions built into FAST and other modeling softwares, but it's definitely going to be more detailed.
In your testimony on page 5, green, I guess, line 160, it talks about 1.5 miles. Could you tell us the information you're trying to explain in your testimony with the 1.5 miles?
Yes, ma'am. So this distance of 1.5 miles was taken from a report written about the Satarsha incident in which a CO2 pipeline release and a plume was extending to at least 1.5 miles from the site of the accident or incident.
That's my questions for now. Thank you.
Mr. Frizzell or Frizzell?
Frizzell.
Good afternoon, Mr. Frizzell. You said just moments ago that FAST will get you a long ways there. And we've had a lot of discussion on, I guess, how far all the way there is. What percentage of all the way there does FAST get you?
I can expand on that. The use of fast modeling, though it assumes flat land, is going to give you a dispersion distance, and some might argue PUC and CFD modeling because CFD modeling has so much detail built in, such as factors that might reduce the distance of dispersion, such as flora, fauna, trees, bushes, those types of things. I don't think anyone's done a comparison of flat land versus the information you might see that comes with modeling a CFD approach for say South Dakota. I don't think that's been done. It'd be interesting to see those outputs, but they will be different, I assure you.
Thank you. That's the question I had.
Good afternoon, and I'm going to take off from where both Commissioner Fegan and Commissioner Hansen, I think, maybe left off and maybe ask it a little bit sharper. So you stepped into this kind of simmering controversy over Aloha and FAST versus CFD, when, where, why.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with SDCL 4941 criteria that we have to use to make a determination on this permit?
Roughly, yes.
And one of those is that we have to determine that the project would not, quote, substantially impair, unquote, the safety of the inhabitants.
Yes.
So my question for you is, in order for us to make that determination, do you believe that we would have to have CFD model runs as opposed to the FAST and Aloha runs that have been done?
No, sir. I don't think CFD model can articulate the consequence of a pipeline release with the use of FAST as a primary modeling program. Where I believe the greatest value would be is in overlaying the dispersion distances on a map and seeing how those are in relation to HCAs or UASs.
And in the latter part of that answer, you anticipated my next question. So if we don't need CFD to make our decision in 58 days, am I understanding from you that it would certainly be wise to have that type of modeling at some of those critical locations along the pipeline? I'm going to ask that person. I've got to follow.
Sure. Definitely give you more detail about where the plume is going to go, how far, what areas are going to be affected, the concentrations at which certain people are going to be affected.
And if you were one of those, quote, people to be affected, would you want to be able to see that model? result?
I would want to see the outputs at least. Maybe not the entirety of the model, because that could get, it'd be hard to interpret the inputs and the modeling process, but definitely the outputs would be very useful.
A pictorial on a map, here's how it might affect my home.
Correct.
Okay, now I'm gonna let you, I'm a rancher. You're an engineer. I'm gonna let you give me a little engineering tutorial.
Okay.
If you can. In the appendix where they've got the table. And it is confidential, but the question I'm gonna ask will not be confidential. And you were concerned because you did not see what the release pressure was that was used as an input. And so my question, it shows the CO2 rate in pounds per second. Why matter?
Great question. So the release rate is going to be an output. So it's basically equivalent to a volume of CO2 released. The pressure is useful to determine, how far that plume is going to go. So for instance, if you have, say, a pressure of 500 pounds PSIG, you would expect a much less distance of travel as compared to a pipeline or release pressure that was released at 2,000 pounds, 2,200 pounds. It's not a linear relationship, but over statistically, you'll see a lower dispersion distance.
So this really opens up kind of a whole other line of questioning. Once the CO2 is released from the pipe, okay, so let's say it's released at 2,100 psi. That 2,100 psi is going to dissipate upon weather features, correct?
Correct, yeah.
And so, going back to my initial question, does that pressure, other than in the very near vicinity and in the very first seconds, does that pressure really matter, or is it more the quantity that's coming out per second?
The release pressure is important because it's going to affect the velocity at which that gas exits. You can make a correlation between the release rate, but generally when we're looking at modeling, one of the big levers we use, when I say lever, it's an input, we use is the release pressure because it can really significantly impact the dispersion distance.
Okay, and I'm following all that, and when you said there's a correlation, see, that's where my mind was, is there's got to be a direct correlation there between those two. And so if you know one, you might be able to get very close to the other. But you don't want to do that math, you just want the number, correct?
Well, there'd be a few assumptions in there.
So this next question is not one that I'd anticipated asking until Commissioner Fegan went there, and it's not why you were brought here, but I'm gonna, and if I wasn't a commissioner, there would be an objection to this, but
Okay.
it might be anyway.
Only from Ms. Edwards.
So you worked for a carbon dioxide transmission company for a number of years.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about leaks that you personally experienced on your system. Tell us about the worst one, tell us about kind of the average one, just give us a real life understanding of what happens.
Of what it looks like?
Yeah.
What it feels like? Yeah. So thankfully I've never had I've never experienced a guillotine failure. That's Satarsha was definitely an interesting one where they have full guillotine. I have seen and been around a few, we'll say 3 minor leaks. All of those were what we call pinhole leaks, so they're extremely small, maybe 1 or 2 in diameter or something like that. And from afar, you'll see some fog. If you're just watching this from a distance, say 100 yards or so, you'll see sort of a foggy area. If it's in a pasture or flat ground, it's going to be a dense fog that is kind of hovering about chest high above the ground. If you get closer than that, which I do not advise, but if you do get closer, you'll notice that the ground around the leak is going to be frozen, or Jules Thompson effect, as it's called. So you'll have a lot of frozen ground and potentially a fog in the area of the leak.
So, very helpful. So, obviously then you did an examination. What caused the pinhole leaks?
From my experience and the anomaly resolution that we did, it was caused by carbonic acid formation.
And so the CO2 that you were transmitting was not from ethanol plants, correct?
No, sir.
What percentage purity was it?
In the 90% range, probably graded closer to 96%, if I remember correctly.
Okay, so you determined you had some corrosion that caused the pinhole leak. What would be your response then to figure out, oh my goodness, is there going to be another one just down the pipe? How do you deal with it from there?
And once you have an anomaly such as a pinhole leak in the pipeline, there's some means and methods to going out there and fixing that. Primarily what occurs is they either fix the pipeline by cutting that piece out and welding a new section in. There's a few options that you can go in and fix it internally, but those are not widely accepted as industry best practice. So essentially you have to go in and replace that section.
Okay, so that didn't quite answer my question. So you fixed this section. How do you know if we're not going to have a pinhole leak elsewhere on the pipeline from the same reason, same cause, just a day later?
Yes. So once you have a leak due to corrosion, you can assume that it's going to happen at some point in the near future, probably along that same pipeline route.
Okay, so as a pipeline operator, how do you deal with that? Is that your cue that it's time to decommission it, or what do you do?
No, you can, there's a few different methods. You can tighten up your spec so it doesn't receive anything with water in it, any amount of water. You can treat with internal corrosion inhibitors, so injecting additional chemicals into the pipeline to make sure that it doesn't corrode internally. Those would be the 2 primary means, as well as corrosion monitoring, thickness monitoring, things like that.
So you talked about kind of 3 pinhole leaks in your career working on those. How many miles of pipeline were you dealing with?
In that system, probably close to 3,000 miles.
And you worked there how long?
2 years.
And how old was the pipe at that point?
Some of it was built back in the late 80s, so maybe 20 years, something like that.
Okay. I think that's the questions I got. Thank you.
That'll bring us to redirect.
Adam, if you don't mind.
Oh, Mr. Rizloff.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. Was there, following Commissioner Nelson, Was there pigging performed on that pipe? Was there anything done other than just operating it?
I believe they picked it annually, something like that. But when you're what's called just a regular pigging, where they run a pig, which is a solid rubber plug through the pipeline, and it cleans out debris, something like that. Or they can run a smart pig, which is a device that's loaded into the pipeline that can measure wall thickness.
But that had been done to that particular pipeline?
I don't recall at this time. Smart pigging, I don't think they were doing.
Okay. I'm gonna go the same direction the three commissioners did, but I ain't gonna done it. We've heard about Aloha, we've heard about FAST, we've heard about CFD. And I'm gonna ask you this, was specifically with regard to FAST modeling, because I've heard at least three witnesses, I guess, endorse FAST modeling. And my question is this, can FAST modeling, with usable adjustments for more complex areas and data, produce a reasonably accurate plume modeling, or more than necessary to accomplish the objective, which is to avoid harm coming to lives and livestock? And I'm talking about with adjustments, noting background.
Yes, sir. I believe that you can adequately determine the consequences of a release for livestock, personnel, families.
And I want to be clear, I'm talking about in areas that are high consequence areas, areas that have, as Commissioner Fegan mentioned, rolling terrain. Can you make adjustments to the FAST model for that terrain without going to CFD modeling? In other words, I can give you a lot of comparisons, but I hope you understand my question.
Yes, sir. You can adjust what's called congestion. So FAST allows you to essentially say it's going to be either a tight space or a wide open space, and you can adjust it based on that to see the intensity of the plume. But again, it's assuming flat ground with a tight space, not a elevated position or long ravines or rivers or anything like that. It's going to be
I was just wondering, from past studies that, okay, I have buildings, and I have livestock, and I have a river, and I have rolling hills. Can there be a variable inserted in that will give you a reasonable outcome with regard to plume modeling?
Yes, sir. You can adjust the congestion factor in the model to account for that. Again, it's not going to be as detailed as CFD modeling, but you can adjust that factor and make the assumption about that factor.
I deal with a lot of modeling in my other work, but normally that's more with economic and other details. But I'm trying to get a better handle. And so I'm going to make a comparison.
Okay.
My father-in-law was a good carpenter when it came to fine furniture. And I've got a bench in my house. Everything fits tightly, perfectly, it looks great. My wife wanted to put flowers in front of the house, so I made a bench. I might be a quarter-inch off here, half-inch off there, but by the time I put the screws in and squeezed a little bit of work, and I set the flowers on top, but it worked. So I went out and fixed it and made it sturdy so it was flat. Now, it does the job. It isn't perfect like what my father-in-law did. So, could I say Aloha is a little bit like the bench at curve? FAST is like the one that's straight, but it's not perfect. It's not, fine furniture quality. And then I have the one my father-in-law built.
I believe that's a reasonable comparison. You know, CFD modeling is going to be, at this present time, the most detailed modeling you can do. It's not going to yield a different distance. You could build the same bench to the exact same dimensions, and it's going to do the exact same thing. Might not be beautiful, but yes, as I say, it's
Well, I think what I did was beautiful. It wasn't perfect though, okay?
Correct.
It wasn't perfectly.
right, and no tool is going to be perfect. We can't replicate the exact natural world. But with CFD modeling, I will say there's going to be assumptions without modeling as well, because you're going to have to model the soil potentially, or you can make an assumption. You have to model the plants, the animals, or make an assumption about those, the wind, the air. You know, you're going to have to model all of that for CFD modeling or make some assumptions. So there's a lot of detail that goes into CFD modeling. It's super interesting, but for this case, I think fast is adequate.
Okay, and I'm not gonna give anybody my address so they can go by and make sure my claim was correct. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Excuse me, it should be pointed out that the one that Greg made does leak.
It was designed to leave.
Redirect.